recently I was in Japan visiting my son and his family. He's a civilian contractor with a government, not a government agency, with a private agency providing services to the Marine bases on the island of Okinawa. He's married local. He's raising a family, has 2 children now, and his mother and I were very anxious to get over there, see the new baby, and enjoy some time with them, which was absolutely wonderful. However, things are much smaller in Japan, especially when you're in the crowded areas. They live in Naha City, which is the capital of Okinawa. So as you can probably imagine, it's pretty crowded over there. They're in a small apartment. It's a little less than 800 square feet. And with a growing family, they're short on space. Now, they've been looking for a house for some time. And being a realtor, I wanted to find out what the market was like over there, what's the landscape, how does one go about buying a house in Japan. So I'm going to go into detail on that right now. Once I had got there and I was talking with my son and my daughter-in-law about the process in searching for a house, I realized that there are a lot of differences. So I'm going to get into those and why the Japanese market is so much different than ours. They're having some problems finding a house that meets their needs because they've got a growing family. They would like to add some extended family in here. So think of mother-in-law suite, or in this case, mother's suite. So an extra bedroom or 2, some office space. They've got a boy and a girl. I would like to mention that if you Google this or go on YouTube and look, there's a great channel by Shu Matsuo. It's the Shu Matsuo Post. And what he talks about in there about purchasing property in Japan, either to live or for investment purposes, he's pretty much on the money. What he says pretty much jives with what I learned from my daughter-in-law, who is the driver in the search for a house for her and my son. So if you'd like to know more about it, I can recommend going to his channel and taking a look. Anyway, our grandson was born end of September. My wife went over to help out, keep house, clean, cook, do the laundry, that sort of thing, help out with the older child while the mom's recovering. She was in the hospital for a week, which is normal in Japan, and then they come home. So she was over there, spent some great time, grandmother time with our granddaughter, and also spent some time with the baby. Grandmothers love this sort of thing. My wife just was in hog heaven, having a great time. However, she had a hotel room nearby because there just wasn't any room in their apartment for her to sleep. So that's kind of the situation. If you can imagine, like a 2-bedroom apartment, single bath, kitchen space, a little bit of dining area, no living room to speak of. Nothing like what we would have in the United States. So this is normal for Japan. And again, being in the capital city, Naha of Okinawa, not a whole lot of room because there are a lot of people there. Anyway, things were tight when they had just the 1 child, and now they've got a second one. So it's there, and they've been looking for a house for some time. Here are some of the things they've been running into. Number 1, there is no MLS or multiple listing service in all of Japan that I could find. There may be something. The only information I came up with was that the government is looking into developing something like this. Over in this country, we're used to National Association of Realtors, state associations, and local associations. And your local associations, of which in Virginia we've got 28 of them, and each association either has its own multiple listing service or contracts the services of a professional one in which they can list property. And this data gets shared. So everybody, I think, is used to going on Zillow or Realtor.com or any one of a number of publicly accessible websites, and you can find property just about anywhere you want to find property. A house to buy, place to live, that sort of thing. That's easy. In Japan, it's different. You don't have a central repository for this data. So what do? Well, your listing agency or brokerage may have a website in which they put the properties that they're selling. And if you know where to look, you can go find them there. However, there's no uniformity to it. So what information you would see depends on what the resources are that brokerage has and what information they can put out there on these properties. The other thing I found that was very interesting is we're used to measuring things in square feet, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, those are the big measurements that you have. In Japan, they measure things in subos, which are equal to 2 tatami mats. And tatami mats are used as floor coverings everywhere. They don't have wall-to-wall carpet. Maybe they do. I haven't seen it in residences, but they cover everything with a tatami mat. And a mat is of uniform dimensions. I can't quote you the exact numbers, but if you go buy a tatami mat, it's going to be of a certain length and a certain width. And floors or rooms are measured in multiples of subos, which are the equivalent of 2 tatami mats. And try and wrap your head around that one. That was the first thing I ran into. So when you see floor plans of houses and you see a number in there, that's the number of subos or tatami mats, however they do the conversion. And the room dimensions are proportional to that, so that if you laid mats on the floor, it would go wall to wall, depending on how many subos large that room is. So that was the first thing that I had to do, was figure out, okay, how do I translate from subos to square feet to see the size of the room and therefore get the overall size of the house or apartment. Another thing I ran into, and I could be wrong about this, but I didn't see any evidence or hear that they have the concept of a buyer's agent or buyer representation. In this case, if you want to house search, you go to the brokerage that has the house you're interested in looking at, contact an agent who will then open it up for you. But when it comes time to do a contract and do all the due diligence that we're used to doing here in the United States, because we want to make sure we go into this thing with our eyes open, there's much more onus or pressure on the buyer to be their own detective in finding out everything they need to do. For example, my son and his wife found the perfect house. 5 bedrooms, enough space. They could move the extended family in, have a room for each child. He would have some office space because he works from home from time to time. Great house. The only thing is, it had a driveway to it that went across another piece of property. And there was nothing in writing like an easement that we're used to that grants them the right to access their home across this adjoining property. So they backed out, but here's the thing. The listing agency didn't provide that information. It happened to be my daughter-in-law's brother, who had a colleague at work who said, hey, I'm looking at this, you might want to check this out. So my daughter-in-law goes to the public records department for Naha City and finds out that it indeed is crossing another piece of property. The seller probably has access as long as the neighbor and he agree and they get along and that sort of thing, but there was no promise that that would continue. So they backed out of that deal. And the thing that gets me is, where is the trained professional who is aware of these things and can look out for them and advise the buyer? So again, that appears to be a big difference between how they do business in Japan, at least on Okinawa. And I'm finding out that this is true throughout the rest of the country over there, and also how we do things here in the States. So even though we had the lawsuit recently where compensation for a buyer's agent is now separate, and there's all that going on. I'm not going to go into detail on that. That's been covered ad nauseum. But at least we still have it. And in Virginia, it's been legally recognized for at least 30 years at this point. So if you are a buyer and want to have a more positive outcome and have everything work out for you, your chances are much, much greater with having a buyer's agent representing you, because they know what to look out for, as opposed to you going into this blind and hoping you think of everything that you need to be aware of. That could be a gotcha once you've signed on the dotted line at the closing table. Here was another thing that really surprised me about Japan, and that is they don't count on property appreciation So they don't expect the house to maintain value. As a matter of fact, after about 50 years, 45 to 50 years, they're thinking very strongly about tearing down the house and rebuilding, because to the Japanese, the value is in the land, not necessarily the house. So, for example, if you're looking at houses, they have a bias toward anything that's 30 years or younger, even though over here we have houses that go back 100, 150, some even 200 years. If they've been maintained and they were built properly, then they're certainly very livable still, and they will have gone up in value since they were built, obviously, because they go at market value, and we all know what the market does. Usually does every year in this country. It goes up either a lot or a little. And really, in the history of home buying in the United States, there's been very few times. 2008 comes to mind, 1929, when there was a stock market crash in this country. Property values devalued then as well. But those are exceptions to the rule. We expect the price to go up every year. And historically, that's been a 4% increase year over year over, say, the last 100 years. Not so in Japan. There, they would build a house on the land and expect that it has a lifetime of about 40 to 50 years, 45 to 50 years. And then at that point, they're thinking strongly about, let's just get rid of this and put up a new one. I can tell you this, on the island of Okinawa, which is subtropical, in other words, the weather pretty much year-round is going to be in this narrow band of 70 to 80 degrees. You've got ocean breezes. This is coming off the Pacific. There's a lot of salt in the air. I did see a lot of deterioration of the buildings. Not a lot, but the older the building, the more you will see it, because there is steel or metal in the structure. And if this moisture gets through the concrete, which it will, because concrete is porous, so that salt air eventually will creep through there, will cause the metal inside the structure to rust, and then you'll get cracking, flaking of concrete, that sort of thing. So is this fixable? Yes, if somebody wanted to maintain it, but I saw a lot of buildings that had this kind of deterioration. And that probably, at least on the island of Okinawa, also fuels that idea of, if the building is beyond a certain age, it's just time to tear it down. Now, the interesting thing is, this could be because of earthquakes or typhoons or whatever, but pretty much everything on Okinawa, whether it's commercial or residential buildings, is made out of concrete. And indeed, the island's got a huge number of concrete plants or cement plants there. And you see trucks on the road all the time. They're always building. It's a very vibrant economy over there. So they've got that going, but you don't see structures made out of wood. It's all concrete. Will this last longer? Who knows? But this is what they build with, and it is subject to deterioration because of the salt atmosphere coming off the ocean. Another idea which I have run into rarely in this country, I've seen it once or twice, but it's common in Japan, is that you can buy the house but not purchase the land that's under it. In other words, a seller might retain that land. You may have a lease for some great length of time. So you own the house, you lease the land. This is an idea that I think that was common in Hawaii, at least I've heard about that. Don't know if it works exactly the same, but let me tell you a little story. My son has a martial arts group that he's been practicing with ever since he was in the Army, and even after he got out, moved back to Okinawa, stayed in touch with them, still does his martial arts practice with them. And his instructor is a retired gunnery sergeant from the Marines who also married a local lady, and they raised a family. He was telling me that in 2012, this is how him buying a house went. He found a place, and they had to negotiate on price. It took several months. They finally reached a value. He goes to closing, and at closing, there's this gunnery sergeant, buyer, there is the real estate agent, there's the seller, and then there's the seller's attorney, who is going to draw up the paperwork and the final agreement, and everybody signs and the money changes hands. They hit a sticking point wherein the buyer was smart enough to ask, the land comes with the house, does it not? And the seller said, no, 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 no. You're just buying the house. And he said, then no deal. So he was getting ready to, pack up his bags and scoot out the door. And the real estate agent had this hurried conversation with the seller. They called the sergeant back and said, okay, you can have the land with the house. Price stayed the same, which I thought was interesting. So no negotiation for more money, that sort of thing. It was just like, he's an American, he's used to, you buy the house, you get the land with it. So they got this all in agreement. The attorney draws this up, and then after they sign things, the buyer, who brought a briefcase with him, opens it up, flips up the lid, turns it around. There was, I think the purchase price he told me was 17 million yen, which works out to maybe $150,000, $160,000. And it was all cash. And he said, you can have the briefcase. And the seller said, oh, no, 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 no. Picks up a paper bag, a couple of paper bags, and starts pulling the cash out of the briefcase, puts it in the paper bags, and who knows where he went with it after that. But the other thing he told me that was really surprising was he had the deed written two different ways, and it got recorded these two different ways. One is where his wife is the primary owner and he's a secondary owner, and then the other deed is where they reverse that. Because of inheritance laws in Japan, you would have to pay tax on inheritance of a house, and he said if she died, I would then have to pay inheritance tax for a property I paid for in full with cash, and it made no sense to him. And I get it. Right now in Virginia and maybe a dozen other states in the country, if you have a husband and wife and they own a property jointly, they have right of survivorship. So if one of them dies and the other one survives, ownership just transfers over. Nothing's done in the courts. Nothing's done with the records. The deed stays the same. In that case, though, in Japan, actually in Okinawa, but I'm assuming this is Japanese law, is he was able to record two deeds one way or the other, and whichever one passes first, fortunately they're both still living, but whichever one passes first, you would just get rid of the other deed and keep the one where the surviving spouse is the primary owner. So, surprise, surprise, I was flabbergasted to hear some of these things, but understand that real estate doesn't work the same like it does in the US. And that's that, but that just gives you a little glimpse into what my son and his wife are up against buying a house in Japan. I do find from Shu Matsuo's YouTube channel that, yes, if you're a foreigner, you are allowed to own property in Japan. It will not make you a citizen to own that. That's an entirely different process. But you can do that. Dealing with banks, though, you're having a much harder time if you're not a Japanese citizen. However, the interesting thing is interest rates are much, much lower than you'll see in the US. For example, I was talking with my daughter-in-law, and she was lamenting the fact that interest rates had gone up. She said for a while there, she could get a 0.8% interest rate on a mortgage, and now it had gone up to 0.95. And she, was a little bothered by that. And the look on her face was priceless when I told her, gee, currently in the US we're paying 6.5%. It's all in what you get used to, folks. All in what you get used to. So those are the differences. It was truly eye-opening to have these conversations, both with my son and his wife, and also with my son's martial arts instructor on his experience, and then to watch Shu Matsuo's channel and see that he's saying pretty much the same thing. So their experience is not unique. This is the way it is in Japan. I have to say, again, because I'm used to how we do business here in Virginia and in the US, that I like our system. Maybe because I'm just used to it, but I like the fact that you have seller representation with a listing agent, you have buyer representation. If you're a buyer and you want a trained professional to help you get through the process so you have a good outcome at closing and beyond, then we have that. It's very well regulated, it's very well documented so that all the pitfalls We don't catch everything 100% of the time, but the big ones are baked into the offer paperwork, and it's just, here's a period of time between when the offer is accepted and when we close, that we have certain conditions that we're going to check out before we get to closing and sign on the dotted line. And these things have to be satisfied so that someone doesn't get a nasty surprise after the fact. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I certainly did, going to Japan and learning about all this, and it was quite eye-opening for me. I hope you got something out of it, and thank you for watching all the way to the end, and we'll catch up with you on the next video. Ugh.